How a psychologist's silent radio kept soldiers fighting long after hope was gone. The rifle barrel pressed cold against Lieutenant Carver's temple, held not by an enemy, but by his own corporal, a farm boy from Nebraska who'd stopped blinking 3 days ago. "Tell me you hear it too, sir," Corporal Hayes whispered, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Tell me the voice is real." Around them, in the flooded shell crater that had become their tomb, 4 other men watched with hollow eyes. Dr. Sarah Chen stood knee-deep in freezing water, one hand still clutching the leather journal she'd been writing in when Hayes snapped. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make the corporal believe in something that didn't exist, or watch him execute his commanding officer before turning the weapon on himself. The date was November 17, 1952. The place was a forgotten valley in Korea where radio contact had died 6 days earlier, and where a civilian psychologist's desperate experiment was about to either save 8 lives or end them all. Wait, before the next revelation happens, if this story has already pulled you into the battlefield, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss any forgotten acts of courage or impossible inventions, subscribe and join our front line of history. The mission's just getting started. Now, back to the scene. "Corporal Hayes," Dr. Chen said, her voice steady despite the water seeping into her boots and the weapon 3 feet from her face. "I hear it. The voice is telling us to hold position until dawn. Can you hear it now?" Hayes's eyes flickered toward her, then back to Carver. The rifle didn't move. "You're lying. You're lying like you lied about the evac, like you lied about the coordinates, like you lied about—" "Lower the weapon, son." Carver's voice came out flat, drained of command. He'd given up arguing an hour ago when Hayes first started hearing the transmissions that weren't there. Dr. Chen's a civilian. She doesn't lie about military orders. That was technically true. Dr. Sarah Chen, 34 years old, formerly of Stanford University's Department of Psychology, had been embedded with the 73rd Infantry Regiment for 11 weeks studying combat stress reactions. She didn't lie about orders because she'd never been authorized to give any. She was supposed to observe, document, and report. She was supposed to understand why some men broke and others didn't, why the human mind could endure weeks of shelling and then shatter over a lost letter from home. She wasn't supposed to be trapped in a crater behind enemy lines with 8 soldiers, no radio contact, and a company of Chinese infantry somewhere in the hills above them. "Listen," she said, taking one careful step toward Hayes. The water sloshed against her thighs. "All of you, listen carefully." The other 5 men shifted. Private First Class Martinez, the youngest at 19, had his hands wrapped around his own throat, a self-soothing gesture Chen had watched develop over the past 3 days. Sergeant Kowalski, the oldest at 41, sat with his back against the crater wall. One leg bent at an angle that meant the shrapnel wound from 2 days ago had gotten worse. Specialist Park stared at nothing, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or counting. Privates Dougherty and Kim huddled together, sharing body heat and terror in equal measure. All of them were listening now. All of them wanted to hear what Hayes was hearing. "There," Chen said, tilting her head as if catching a faint signal. "Frequency 47.5. They're saying the 38th Regiment made contact at grid Delta 7, relief column forming now." She was making it up, all of it. The radio in the crater had died on the 2nd day, its vacuum tubes shattered by the same mortar round that had wounded Kowalski and killed their medic. The real transmissions had stopped before that. Command had either written them off or couldn't spare the resources to extract one isolated squad. They were ghosts on the roster, probably already marked KIA in some field office 50 miles south. But Hayes's finger eased off the trigger, just slightly. "You hear it?" he asked, desperate. "I hear it," Chen lied, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Some professional boundary Shed maintained through 11 weeks of watching men die and documenting their final words. "Lieutenant Carver, do you hear it?" Carver understood immediately. His eyes met hers over the rifle barrel, and she saw the calculation there. The weighing of one lie against 8 lives. The choice between truth and survival. "Affirmative," he said. "Relief column at Delta 7. ETA 36 hours, if we can hold position." Hayes lowered the rifle. His whole body shook as he sank down into the water, and Martinez moved to take the weapon from his hands. No one spoke. They all knew what had just happened, and none of them acknowledged it. Chen had crossed a line. She'd stopped being an observer and become a participant, stopped documenting collapse and started actively preventing it. She'd weaponized hope. The question was whether she could keep a weapon loaded. The crater had become their universe 6 days earlier, though Chen's involvement with these men stretched back to early September. She'd requested assignment to a forward unit, arguing that combat stress could only be properly studied in combat conditions. The Pentagon psychologists had resisted. She was too valuable as a researcher, too female for the front lines, too civilian to understand military necessity. But Dr. Chen had credentials they couldn't ignore. 2 years with Army Psychiatric Unit stateside, a published paper on traumatic dissociation that had gotten attention at the highest levels, and a stubborn insistence that lab conditions couldn't replicate the specific breaks she was seeing in returned soldiers. They'd sent her to Korea with strict limitations: no combat zones, no forward positions, regular debriefs, and immediate evacuation if conditions deteriorated. She'd violated every restriction within 3 weeks. Lieutenant Carver had been her entry point, a 29-year-old platoon leader from Oregon with an engineering degree and a Purple Heart from the Pusan perimeter. He'd initially resisted her presence, viewing her as either a spy or a liability. But Chen had proven herself by shutting up and staying out of the way, by patching minor wounds when the medics were overwhelmed, by never asking stupid questions and never pretending to understand things she didn't. They developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and shared coffee. Carver would let her observe his men during downtime, and she'd provide feedback on who needed rotation, who was close to breaking, who could handle one more patrol. It was an informal arrangement that violated protocol on both sides, but it worked. Until November 11th, when everything stopped working. The patrol was supposed to be routine, recon of a supply route the Chinese had been using to move equipment at night. 12 men, including Chen, in and out before dawn. But intelligence had been wrong about enemy strength, or right about enemy strength and wrong about enemy position, or just catastrophically wrong in the way intelligence often was. They'd walked into an ambush at 0430 hours. The first mortar round had killed their radio man instantly. The second had collapsed part of the hillside, and within 90 seconds they were in full retreat with Chinese infantry pursuing. Carver had ordered everyone into the crater, a shell hole from earlier fighting, maybe 15 feet across and 8 feet deep, half filled with rainwater and debris. They'd held there through the first day, while Chinese soldiers combed the hills above, calling to each other in Mandarin and occasionally firing into suspicious shadows. On the second day, a mortar barrage had killed PFC Thompson and their medic, Specialist Rodriguez. The same barrage had destroyed their radio and wounded Kowalski badly enough that moving him became impossible. On the third day, the Chinese had moved on, apparently satisfied that anything in the valley was already dead. But by then, the unit was trapped. Kowalski couldn't walk, they had no way to signal friendly forces, and moving during daylight meant exposure on terrain where snipers could work from 1,000 yards. On the fourth day, Private Martinez had stopped being able to eat solid food. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a C-ration can. On the fifth day, Specialist Park had spent 6 hours convinced he could hear his mother calling from the ridgeline. Lieutenant Carver had to physically restrain him from climbing out of the crater. On the 6th day, Corporal Hayes started hearing the radio. Chen had recognized what was happening immediately. The technical term was shared psychotic disorder, sometimes called folie à deux when it affected two people, though there were documented cases of entire groups developing synchronized delusions under extreme stress. Hayes's auditory hallucinations weren't random. They were his mind's attempt to reimpose order on a situation that had become unbearable. The phantom radio provided structure, command authority, hope. It gave him a reason to survive the next hour. The problem was that delusions were contagious, especially in enclosed groups under sustained trauma. If Chen confirmed Hayes's hallucination, she risked triggering a cascade. Other men hearing other impossible things. The group's grasp on reality fragmenting until they were no longer capable of making survival decisions. If she didn't confirm it, Hayes was going to start executing people, beginning with Carver and probably ending with himself. She'd chosen contagion. She'd chosen controlled mass psychosis over immediate violence, and now she had to manage it. "All right," Carver said, after a long silence, his command voice returning now that the rifle was no longer pointed at his head. "If relief is coming, we need to be ready to move. Sergeant Kowalski, how's that leg?" Kowalski grimaced. "I'll manage, sir. Just need a hand getting up." It was a lie. Kowalski's leg was going septic. Chen could smell the infection even in the cold November air. He'd lost color over the past 48 hours, his skin taking on a gray cast that meant tissue death and systemic poisoning. He needed a field hospital and antibiotics, neither of which existed in this crater. But admitting that would undermine the fiction they were all now committed to maintaining. If relief was coming, Kowalski could hold on. If relief was coming, they just needed to survive one more day. If relief was coming, everything they'd endured had meaning. "Dr. Chen," Carver continued, "you've got the most experience with stress casualties. If we need to move Sergeant Kowalski quickly, what's the best way to manage pain?" Chen understood what he was really asking. How do we keep playing this game? How do we maintain the illusion that we're following orders rather than waiting to die? "Morphine from the medical kit," she said, though they'd used the last morphine syringe on Rodriguez as he bled out on day 2. "But we should save it for the extraction. Movement's gonna hurt worse than waiting." Agreed. Carver looked around the crater, his gaze touching each man in turn. "We hold position until further orders." Standard watch rotation. 2 hours on, 4 hours rest. Park and Doherty, you're up first. Everyone else, try to sleep. No one was going to sleep. They all knew that. But the structure helped. The familiar rhythm of military routine. The pretense that they were still functional soldiers rather than trapped animals waiting for death. Chen settled against the crater wall beside Martinez, who was shaking hard enough that his helmet rattled against the frozen mud. She put one hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors run through him like electrical current. "You're doing good," she told him quietly. "Just a little longer." "How long?" Martinez whispered. "How long do you really think, ma'am?" Chen looked up at the gray Korean sky, at the rim of the crater that had become the boundary of their world. She thought about the statistical likelihood of rescue, about the fact that no one knew exactly where they were, about the Chinese patrols that had swept these hills, and the winter that was closing in. "Until we get the word to move," she said, "that's all we need to worry about. Until we get the word." It wasn't an answer, but Martinez nodded and closed his eyes, and Chen pulled out her leather journal, somehow still intact despite everything, and began to write. The first entry read, Day 6. Hayes attempted violence against CO. Intervention required. Have initiated shared delusional framework as temporary stabilization measure. Ethical concerns significant, but alternatives appeared limited. Monitoring for cascade effects. She didn't write the rest of what she was thinking, that she'd just committed professional suicide, that no legitimate psychological authority would ever approve her methods, that she was keeping 8 men functional through mass hallucination and lies. She didn't write that it might be the only thing that worked. Part 2. The Labyrinth of Tactics. The phantom radio started broadcasting 3 times a day. Chen didn't plan it that way initially. The schedule emerged organically from the group's needs and her growing understanding of how to manage collective delusion. Morning broadcasts provided structure and purpose for the day ahead. Afternoon transmissions offered reassurance during the worst hours, when cold and hunger made time move like freezing mud. Evening reports gave them something to hold on to through the night, when darkness brought its own terrors. She'd chosen 600, 1400, and 2000 hours because those were standard communication windows for forward units. The men expected to hear from command at those times, which made the hallucination easier to maintain. Chen would tilt her head as if listening, then relay information in careful, measured phrases that mixed plausible military jargon with just enough vagueness to avoid contradiction. Relief column, delayed by weather, she reported on day 7, morning transmission. New ETA is 36 hours. Continue holding position. Air support standing by for emergency extraction if enemy contact occurs. The lies came easier each time. She told herself she was maintaining combat effectiveness, preserving unit cohesion, preventing psychological collapse. She told herself she'd document everything and submit to professional review once they were extracted, if they were extracted. She tried not to think about what happened if they weren't. Lieutenant Carver understood the game she was playing, though they never discussed it explicitly. On the morning of day 8, he pulled her aside during watch rotation. "I need to know your assessment," he said quietly. "Not for them, for me. Real numbers." She looked at Kowalski, who was now barely conscious, his fever spiking despite the cold. She looked at Martinez, whose hands hadn't stopped shaking in 4 days. She looked at Park, Doherty, Kim, all of them showing signs of progressive deterioration. Hayes was the first acute break, she said. But they're all unstable. Severe sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, sustained traumatic stress exposure. The delusion is buying us time, but it's not treatment, it's triage. How much time? Depends on whether anyone else breaks. Chen chose her words carefully. The shared framework is holding because they all want it to hold. The moment someone questions it, really questions it, the whole thing could collapse. And if that happens, we're back to rifles and temples, or worse. If the delusion breaks suddenly, we could see multiple simultaneous psychotic episodes. Panic, violence, complete disorientation. In this environment, that means casualties. Carver was silent for a moment, watching his men. So we keep lying. We keep providing structure, Chen corrected. There's a difference, is there? Chen didn't have a good answer for that. In her academic work, she'd studied the ethics of therapeutic deception, the carefully bounded uses of placebos, the strategic withholding of information to prevent patient harm. But those frameworks assumed eventual disclosure, therapeutic relationship, clinical settings. None of it applied to 8 people trapped in a freezing crater, lying to each other to stay sane enough to survive. "I think," she said finally, "that ethics are contextual, and our context is extreme. That's a yes or no question, doctor." Then no, there's no difference. We're lying. But we're lying to keep them alive. And I'll take that over honesty if honesty means watching them tear themselves apart. Carver nodded slowly. Then we're agreed. But I need you to do something else. I need you to start preparing them for disappointment. What do you mean? Relief isn't coming. You know it, I know it. But if we maintain the illusion too long, the crash when it fails will be worse. So start building in delays, equipment failures, weather problems, Chinese movements blocking the route. Give them a reason to accept that extraction keeps getting pushed back, so when it doesn't happen at all, they're already conditioned for it. Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're asking me to manage their hope down, slowly enough that it doesn't destroy them, but fast enough that when we have to start moving on our own, they're ready for it. Can you do that? She thought about the psychological mechanics involved, the careful calibration of expectation and disappointment, the gradual erosion of certainty, the way trauma could be spread out over time to make it bearable when concentrated exposure would shatter someone completely. It was sophisticated torture disguised as therapy. Yes, she said, I can do that. The 1400 hours transmission on day 8 included new complications. Relief column engaged with enemy forces at checkpoint Delta 9, extraction delayed minimum 12 hours while they secure the route. HQ advises minimal movement, conserve all resources. Air reconnaissance confirms no immediate enemy presence in Valley Sector. Chen watched the men's reactions carefully. Hayes nodded, accepting the information without question. He'd become dependent on the transmissions, his mental stability now entirely bound up in believing they were real. Martinez looked relieved rather than disappointed, as if the delay meant one more reprieve from having to move, to act, to face whatever came next. But Specialist Park was frowning. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "how are they transmitting if our radio's dead?" The question hung in the frozen air like a grenade. Chen felt every eye turn toward her, felt the delusion's fragile architecture begin to crack. "Different frequencies," she said immediately. "Our radio's receiver is damaged, but I'm picking up the transmission on—" She glanced at her wrist as if checking a watch she wasn't wearing. "On backup channel 9, it's standard emergency protocol." They broadcast on multiple frequencies to reach isolated units. It was plausible enough that Park accepted it with a nod. But Carver's eyes met hers, and she saw the warning there. Someone was starting to question. The framework was under stress. That night, after the 2000 hours transmission, relief column held at checkpoint, new extraction window tomorrow, 0800-1200 hours. Maintain position and security. Chen found herself unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went bone deep. She sat with her journal balanced on her knees, trying to organize her observations into something coherent. Day 8 observations. Hayes, index patient. Auditory hallucinations now systemic. Hears radio without prompting. Mood elevated when transmissions received. Severe anxiety between broadcasts. Classic dependency pattern. Martinez, acute stress response with persistent tremor, hypervigilance, inability to eat. Shows signs of dissociative episodes. Losing time, unclear on what day it is. Responds well to physical contact and reassurance. Park, questioning delusion parameters. Possible first signs of reality testing. Monitor closely. For either breakthrough insight, dangerous, or deeper commitment to shared framework, preferable. Kowalski, septic shock progressing, fever, decreased consciousness, visible infection. Medical evacuation required within 24 to 48 hours for survival. Note, patient unaware of severity, may be preferable. Dougherty and Kim, functioning as bonded pair, mutually supportive but both showing signs of severe fatigue and malnutrition, will likely deteriorate simultaneously if separated. Carver, maintaining command structure despite personal stress, aware of deception but committed to tactical necessity. Concern, how will he cope with moral injury post-event? She paused on that last point. Moral injury, the psychological wound that came from participating in events that violated one's ethical framework. Soldiers got it from following orders that led to civilian casualties, from failing to save wounded comrades, from surviving when others didn't. Chen had documented dozens of cases, watched strong men break years after combat because they couldn't reconcile what they'd done with who they believed themselves to be. What was she doing to Carver? What was she doing to herself? She was about to write more when Hayes spoke from the darkness. "Dr. Chen, are you hearing them?" Shen's hand stopped. "Hearing who, Corporal?" "The Chinese, up on the ridge. I think they're back." Every man in the crater was instantly alert despite the late hour, weapons raised, eyes scanning the darkness above them. Chen strained to hear anything beyond the wind and the distant sound of water moving somewhere in the valley. "I don't hear anything," Carver said quietly. "Hayes, you sure?" "I'm sure, sir. Voices, speaking Chinese. They're searching for something." Chen's training kicked in. Was this a real threat or an extension of Hayes's hallucinations? Had the phantom radio voices evolved into phantom enemy voices? Was his psychosis escalating in complexity? Then she heard it too. Faint, distant, but real. Human voices speaking Mandarin somewhere on the ridgeline above them. "Contact," Carver whispered. "Everyone down. Silent protocol." They pressed against the crater walls, barely breathing, as the voices moved across the ridge. Chen couldn't make out words, but the tone suggested casual conversation rather than active search. A patrol, maybe, or soldiers moving between positions. The voices faded. 10 minutes passed. 20. Finally, Carver signaled all clear. "They didn't see us," Darty whispered. "They walked right past." "Luck," Carver said, "or low visibility. Either way, we're still concealed." He turned to Chen. "Any word from command about enemy activity in the sector?" She understood what he was asking. Does the phantom radio account for this? Can you integrate reality into the delusion smoothly enough to maintain credibility? "Negative," she said. "But this confirms what HQ told us earlier. Enemy forces are mobile in the area. That's why extraction keeps getting delayed. They're waiting for a clear window." It was seamless. The real Chinese patrol became evidence supporting the fictional radio transmissions. Reality and delusion were weaving together so thoroughly that Chen was no longer sure she could separate them. She wasn't sure she wanted to. Part 3. Revelation and Collapse. On day 9, Sergeant Kowalski stopped being able to speak coherently. Chen checked him at dawn and found his fever had spiked above 104 degrees, his skin burning to the touch despite the November cold. When she tried to get him to drink water, he pushed her hand away and mumbled something about his daughter's piano recital, an event that was presumably months in the past and 3,000 miles away. "He's septic," she told Carver quietly. "The infection spread to his bloodstream. Without antibiotics and surgical intervention, he has maybe 24 hours, probably less." Carver looked at his sergeant, a man who'd served with him since stateside training, who'd carried wounded men through the Pusan perimeter, who'd volunteered for this patrol knowing the risks. "Can we do anything?" Chen thought about the medical supplies they had left. A handful of bandages, some sulfa powder that was probably useless against advanced infection, a morphine syringe they'd pretended to use 2 days ago. She thought about amputation as a desperate measure, about the fact that attempting field surgery with no anesthetic and no sterile equipment would kill Kowalski faster than the infection. "No," she said, "we can't. So we watch him die. We keep him comfortable. We stay with him. That's all we can do." The 060 hours transmission that morning included a medical update. "HQ advises we have priority medical evacuation status. Chopper standing by once enemy clears from LZ. Estimate 6 to 8 hours. Chen delivered the message knowing it was empty, knowing Kowalski wouldn't live 6 to 8 hours, knowing that she was lying to a dying man about rescue that would never come. Hayes nodded and actually smiled. "You hear that, Sarge? You just gotta hang on a little longer. They're coming for us." Kowalski didn't respond. His eyes were open but unfocused, tracking things that weren't there. By 10 o'clock hours, he'd stopped moving entirely, except for shallow breathing. The men took turns sitting with him, holding his hand, talking about memories and home, and promises about what they'd do when they got stateside. Chen listened to their stories and documented everything, even as guilt pressed down on her chest like physical weight. At 11:47 hours, Kowalski's breathing stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of something breaking, of a promise proved empty, of hope crashing against reality and shattering. "No," Hayes said. His voice was very small. "No," they said. "The radio said." "Radio's wrong," Park interrupted. He stood up slowly, water sloshing around his knees, his expression shifting into something hard and cold. "Specialist Park," Carver began. "There is no radio," Park continued. His voice was rising. "There's no relief column. There's no extraction. There never was. We're sitting in this fucking hole waiting to die, while Dr. Chen tells us fairy tales about rescue." Every eye turned to Chen. She could see the framework collapsing in real time, the fragile construction of shared belief crumbling as reality forced its way in. Hayes was shaking his head frantically. Martinez had his hands over his ears. Doherty and Kim were staring at her with expressions of betrayal so pure it hurt to meet their eyes. "Is that true?" Hayes asked. His voice cracked. "Dr. Chen, is that true? Have you been lying to us?" Chen looked at Carver. He gave her the smallest nod. "Your call, your framework, your responsibility." She could lie again. She could insist the transmissions were real, that Park was suffering from combat stress, that they just needed to maintain faith a little longer. She could double down on the delusion and hope it held long enough for… what? What was she hoping for? Or she could tell the truth and watch everything collapse. "Yes," she said quietly, "I've been lying to you." The impact was immediate and devastating. Hayes made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. Martinez curled into himself, rocking back and forth. Park's expression shifted from anger to something worse, vindication mixed with despair, the terrible satisfaction of being right about the worst possible thing. "You bitch," Hayes breathed. "You fucking bitch, we trusted you." "Stand down, Corporal," Carver said sharply. "Dr. Chen did what she had to do to keep us functional." "Functional?" Park laughed, wild and broken. "Kowalski's dead. We're trapped here with no extraction coming. How is that functional?" "We're alive," Carver said. "We're coherent. We haven't torn each other apart. That's because Dr. Chen gave us something to hold on to when we had nothing else." "She gave us lies," Park shot back. "She made us believe. She made us hope." "Would you rather have put a rifle in your mouth on day 6? Carver's voice was cold enough to freeze blood. "Because that's where we were headed before she intervened. Hayes was ready to execute me. Martinez couldn't stop shaking long enough to hold a weapon. You were hearing your mother's voice calling you to Chinese fire. We were done. She bought us time." "Time for what?" Park demanded. "Time to watch Kowalski die? Time to freeze to death in this hole? Time to figure out a real plan," Jen interrupted. She stood up, water streaming from her clothes, and faced them all. "You want truth? Here's truth. No one's coming for us. Command either thinks we're dead or can't spare resources for extraction. The radio died on day 2. Everything since then has been me improvising psychological triage to prevent total collapse." She could see them processing this, could see the stages of acceptance and denial playing across their faces. "But here's also truth," she continued. "We are still alive. We are still capable of movement. Sergeant Kowalski was our only immobile casualty, and he's…" She swallowed hard. "He's gone now. That means we can move. We can try to make it south to friendly lines." "Through Chinese-controlled territory?" Dougherty said. "That's suicide." "Maybe," Chen agreed, "but staying here definitely is. We're low on food. Water's questionable. Cold is getting worse every night. We stay here, we die slow. We move, we at least have a chance." "A chance," Park repeated flatly. "What kind of chance? 1%? Half a percent?" Chen looked at Lieutenant Carver. He'd been watching this entire exchange in silence, letting her take the lead. But now she needed him to step back in, not as a co-conspirator in deception, but as a commander making tactical decisions. Carver seemed to understand. He moved to the center of the crater, his presence drawing attention even in the midst of crisis. "Listen up," he said. "Dr. Chen made calls I would have made myself if I'd thought of them first. She kept us together when we were falling apart. But she's right. The situation's changed. We can't stay here. So here's what we're going to do." He pulled out a map, waterlogged but still readable, and spread it on a relatively flat section of crater wall. "We're here, approximately grid 347-892. Friendly lines are here, 43 kilometers south-southwest. Chinese forces are concentrated along the main valleys, which means we move through the high country, slower, harder, but less contact." "In our condition," Martinez said. His voice was very quiet. "Sir, I can barely hold a weapon. Half of us can barely walk." "Then the other half helps them," Carver said. "We've got 7 men left. We move in pairs, rotate the lead, maintain tactical spacing. Dr. Chen moves in the center of the formation where she's most protected." "I can walk on my own," Chen said. "Not the point, Doctor. You're the only one who knows enough about combat psychology to keep us from imploding if someone else breaks. You're too valuable to risk on point." It was a tactical assessment wrapped around care, and Chen felt something shift in her chest, gratitude mixed with responsibility, mixed with the bone-deep exhaustion of knowing she had to keep performing, keep managing, keep everyone functional for at least 43 more kilometers. "When do we move?" she asked. "Tonight," Carver said. "We use darkness for concealment, move through tomorrow, find shelter before the next nightfall. 43 kilometers in rough terrain, cold weather with limited supplies. Figure 3 days minimum if we're lucky, 5 if we're not." "And if we encounter Chinese patrols?" Park asked. Carver's expression went flat. "We avoid if possible. We engage if necessary. We do not surrender." Questions? There was a long silence. Chen could see them calculating odds, weighing survival chances, trying to find hope in a situation that offered very little. Hayes still looked shattered, his faith in the phantom radio, in her, destroyed. Martinez was still shaking. Park's face was closed off, angry, betrayed. But they were listening, they were processing, they were still functional enough to make decisions. It would have to be enough. They spent the afternoon preparing for movement. Chen helped sort through their remaining supplies. 6 C-ration cans, 3 canteens of questionable water, ammunition that was adequate but not plentiful, medical supplies that consisted of bandages and prayer. Carver organized them into movement pairs. Park with Hayes, Doherty with Kim, Martinez with himself. Chen would move between pairs as needed, providing support or intervention if anyone started to break. Before they buried Kowalski, Chen asked permission to say something. Carver nodded. "Sergeant Kowalski died because we couldn't get him the medical care he needed," she said, looking at each man in turn. "Not because the radio lied, not because rescue didn't come, because in war, sometimes people die even when you do everything right. But he died believing we had a plan, believing we were trying, believing we hadn't given up. I don't regret giving him that." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I lied to you. I'll own that. I made you believe in something that wasn't real because the alternative was watching you destroy yourselves and each other. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe I crossed lines that shouldn't be crossed. But I'd do it again if it meant keeping you alive long enough to have this conversation, to make this choice, to try for home." Hayes was crying silently. Martinez had his head bowed. Park was still angry, but the edge had softened slightly. "We move tonight," Chen continued. No more phantom radios, no more lies about rescue. Just 7 soldiers, 1 terrified psychologist, and 43 kilometers of very bad terrain. Those are the facts. That's the truth. But here's one more truth. We can make it. Not because some voice on a radio said so, but because we're still here, still fighting, still refusing to quit. Is this another psychological trick? Park asked. Some kind of motivational manipulation? Yes, Chen said honestly. Everything I say is psychological manipulation. That's my job. The difference is, now you know it. You get to decide whether it works anyway. Park stared at her for a long moment, then looked at Carver. Sir? We move at 1900 hours, Carver said. Get what rest you can. It's going to be a long 3 days. They buried Kowalski in a shallow grave scraped from the frozen earth, marked with his dog tags wrapped around a makeshift cross. Chen said a few words, not prayers, since she didn't know his Norwegian, but acknowledgments of service and sacrifice and the simple, terrible fact of his absence. Then they settled in to wait for darkness, and Chen found herself sitting beside Hayes. I really heard it, he said after a while. The radio. I know it wasn't real, but I heard it. How does that work? Chen considered how to answer. Your brain was trying to survive, she said finally. It gave you something to believe in because belief was the only thing keeping you functional. The voice was real to you because you needed it to be real. So I'm crazy? You're traumatized. There's a difference. Crazy implies permanent dysfunction. Trauma is what happens when your brain does everything it can to protect you from unbearable conditions. Sometimes that includes hearing things that aren't there. Hayes was quiet for a long time. Will it happen again? I don't know, Chen said honestly. Maybe. But now you know what it is. That gives you some control over it. You can recognize when your brain is trying to create comfort, and you can decide whether to trust it. That's not very comforting. No, Chen agreed, but it's true, and I'm done lying to you about comfort. Hayes almost smiled. You're a terrible therapist, ma'am. The worst, Chen agreed, but I'm a decent traveling companion, and we're going to need each other over the next 3 days. As 1900 hours approached, Chen made her final notes in the leather journal. Her hand was steady, despite everything, trained by years of documentation to record observations even under duress. Day 9, final entry. Delusional framework collapsed following Kowalski's death. Initial break catastrophic, but contained through immediate truth-telling and tactical reframing. Group now functioning on realistic assessment of situation. All 7 remaining soldiers demonstrate stress symptoms but remain capable of coordinated movement. Personal note: have violated every ethical standard of my profession. Have weaponized hope, managed delusions, and maintained systematic deception of vulnerable patients. Will submit to full professional review and accept consequences if we survive extraction. Second personal note: would do it all again. 8 men entered this crater. 7 are leaving. In context, that's victory. She closed the journal and tucked it inside her jacket, then stood as Lieutenant Carver gave the order to move out. They climbed out of the crater that had been their prison and salvation and began the long walk south, toward friendly lines, toward home, toward whatever came next. Part 4. The Alliance and the Turning Point. The first night was worse than the crater. At least in the hole, they'd had shelter from wind, concealment from observation, a defined space that provided psychological, if not physical, comfort. Moving through Korean winter darkness across terrain that alternated between frozen rice paddies and wooded hills was its own kind of torture. Chen walked in the middle of the formation, between Park and Hayes in front, Doherty and Kim behind. She could hear Martinez and Carver bringing up the rear, moving slowly to accommodate Martinez's deteriorating condition. Every sound made her flinch. Wind through dead vegetation, ice cracking underfoot, the distant report of artillery from some other sector of the war. They covered maybe 6 kilometers in 5 hours, stopping frequently to rest and listen and make sure they hadn't been spotted. Personal note: have violated every ethical standard of my profession. Have weaponized hope, managed delusions, and maintained systematic deception of vulnerable patients. Will submit to full professional review and accept consequences if we survive extraction. Second personal note: would do it all again. 8 men entered this crater. 7 are leaving. In context, that's victory. By 0200 hours, Carver called a halt in a small depression that offered minimal cover, but better than nothing. "We hold here until 500, he whispered. No fire, no talking. 2-hour watches, same rotation. Chen settled against a tree and felt her body's exhaustion slam into her like a physical force. She'd slept maybe 10 hours total over the past 9 days, had eaten perhaps half her normal caloric intake, had spent more than a week managing 8 traumatized soldiers while dealing with her own trauma response. She was so tired she couldn't feel her fingers. But when Carver woke her for second watch at 0200, she came alert immediately, every sense scanning for threats. This was what sustained stress did. It burned out normal human resilience, but left you with hypervigilance so profound you could wake from deep sleep to full combat awareness in seconds. She sat with Hayes during the watch, both of them silent, both listening to the night sounds that might be wind or might be enemy movement. "You know what the worst part is?" Hayes said finally, his voice barely audible. "What?" "I miss the radio. I miss believing someone was coming for us. Even knowing it was fake, even knowing you made it up, I'd rather believe the lie than live in this." Chen understood. "That's normal," she said. "The brain prefers comforting fiction to uncomfortable truth. That's why delusions work." "So what do we do now? How do we keep going without something to believe in?" It was the fundamental question, the one Chen had been wrestling with since the delusional framework collapsed. How did you motivate people when hope was gone? How did you keep them moving when every rational assessment suggested they were already dead? "We believe in each other," she said. "Not in rescue, not in radio voices, in the fact that we're still here, still moving, still fighting. That's real. That's something you can trust." Is that another psychological trick? Yes, Chen said, but it's also true. Both things can be real at the same time. Hayes was quiet for a while. Then, "I think I get it now, why you lied. You were giving us a reason to make it through one more day, and then another, until we got strong enough to face the truth." That's a generous interpretation. It's the only one that makes sense. Otherwise, you're just cruel, and you're not cruel. Chen felt something in her chest crack open. Not guilt exactly, but acknowledgement. "Thank you, Corporal. That helps." At 0500, they started moving again. The sky was just beginning to lighten, gray dawn seeping across the Korean landscape, when Park raised a hand for halt. "Movement," he breathed. 11 o'clock, maybe 200 meters. Everyone froze. Chen strained to see what Park had spotted and found it. A group of figures moving along a ridgeline, silhouetted against the dawn sky. Too far to identify, but their movement suggested patrol. "Chinese?" Carver whispered. "Can't tell. Could be ours." It was the worst kind of uncertainty. Friendly forces would be salvation, food, medical care, extraction, end of the nightmare. Enemy forces would be combat they were desperately unprepared for. And approaching unknown forces to determine which they were might get them killed either way. "We hold position," Carver decided. "Let them pass. We can't risk contact until we know what we're dealing with." They waited in frozen silence for 20 minutes while the patrol moved across the ridgeline and eventually disappeared. Chen felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt Martinez shaking beside her, felt the accumulated stress of the past 9 days pressing down like atmospheric pressure. When the patrol was gone, they continued south. By 800 hours, they were exhausted enough that Carver called another halt in a small stand of trees. They had perhaps 16 hours of darkness ahead of them for concealed movement, but pushing too hard meant someone would collapse, and a collapsed soldier meant either abandonment or slowed movement that endangered everyone. Chen distributed the remaining sea rations, 1 can shared between 2 people, barely enough to maintain basic function. She watched Martinez try to eat and fail, his hands shaking too badly to operate the can opener. "Let me," she said, taking the can from him. She opened it, pulled out the cold hash, and fed him small pieces with a spoon from the medical kit. He accepted the food like a child, mechanically chewing and swallowing without tasting. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm trying to hold it together, ma'am. I'm really trying." "You're doing fine," Chen said. "Better than fine. You're still moving, still fighting. That's all anyone can ask." "What happens if I can't anymore? If I just stop?" Chen looked at Carver, who was watching this exchange from across the small clearing. He gave her a tiny nod. "Tell him the truth." "Then we carry you," she said. "We don't leave anyone behind. That's the deal." "That'll slow us down." "Yes, but we're not leaving you behind." Martinez closed his eyes, and Chen saw tears leak from beneath the lids. "Thank you, ma'am." They rested until 1700 hours, then began moving again as shadows lengthened across the hills. The second night was marginally better than the first. They developed a rhythm, learned how to move as a unit, figured out the optimal spacing and communication signals. They covered 10 kilometers before Carver called the next halt, putting them roughly 27 kilometers from friendly lines. "We're making good time," he told the group. "If we maintain this pace, we reach friendly territory tomorrow night." If. Such a small word for such enormous uncertainty. But Chen saw what he was doing, providing incremental goals, breaking the impossible journey into manageable pieces, giving them something concrete to aim for. It was good leadership and decent psychology combined. They rested. They moved. They rested again. The routine was almost meditative. 1 foot, then another, then another. The world reduced to terrain and distance and the next checkpoint. On the 3rd night, they ran into trouble. It happened at 2200 hours. They were crossing a small valley when Hayes, on point, raised his fist for immediate stop. Chen froze mid-step and felt her heart rate spike as training and instinct fought for control. Voices. Close. Speaking Mandarin. They went to ground immediately, pressing flat against frozen earth, controlling their breathing. Chen could see a farmhouse maybe 100 meters away, lights visible through windows. A Chinese command post, probably, or a rest station for patrols. The voices got closer. 2 soldiers walking a perimeter, rifles slung casually. Not alert, not searching, just routine patrol, probably bored, definitely not expecting contact. Carver made a decision. He signaled, "Hold position, let them pass." The soldiers walked within 20 meters of where Chen lay pressed against the earth. She could hear their conversation clearly now, could make out enough Mandarin to understand they were talking about food, about how long until rotation, about how much they hated the cold. They were complaining about the same things American soldiers complained about. The recognition was visceral and unsettling. The patrol passed. Chen waited for the all-clear signal, waited for Carver to give the order to move, waited. Martinez sneezed. It wasn't loud, just a sharp exhalation, the kind of involuntary response that happens when your body's been suppressing everything for too long. But in the frozen night air, it carried like a gunshot. The Chinese soldiers stopped walking. Chen watched through blades of dead grass as they turned, as they unslung their rifles, as they called out in Mandarin, "Who's there? Identify yourself!" Carver was already moving. He came up from the ground with his rifle raised and fired twice, sharp, controlled bursts that dropped both soldiers before they could raise an alarm. The sound of gunfire shattered the night. Immediately, lights came on in the farmhouse. Voices shouted. More soldiers were coming. "Run," Carver ordered. "East, into the tree line. Go, go, go." They ran. Chen grabbed Martinez and half-dragged him as they sprinted across open ground toward the relative safety of trees. Behind them, rifle fire erupted, wild, unaimed, but getting closer as more Chinese soldiers emerged from the farmhouse. Park went down with a cry. Kim stopped to grab him, and Chen saw blood streaming from Park's leg. "Keep moving," Carver shouted. He and Doherty were laying down covering fire, disciplined bursts that forced the Chinese to take cover rather than pursuing effectively. They made it to the tree line. Park was conscious but couldn't walk. The bullet had hit his calf, shattering bone or severing muscle, or both. Kim and Doherty carried him between them, while Carver and Hayes provided rear security. They ran for 20 minutes, crashing through undergrowth, making noise that would draw pursuit, but having no choice. When Carver finally called a halt in a small ravine, they were all gasping, bleeding from branches and falls, completely exhausted. "Head count," Carver panted. "Sound off." Hayes, "Good." Park, wounded but mobile with support. Kim, "Good." Doherty, "Good." Martinez, "Good." His voice was shaking but present. "Dr. Chen?" "Good." She wasn't, not really. Her lungs were burning. Her legs felt like water. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, but she was functional, and that was all that mattered. "All right," Carver said. "Park, let Dr. Chen look at that leg. Everyone else, security perimeter. We hold here until we're sure we're not being followed. Then we keep moving." Chen examined Park's leg by feel in the darkness. The bullet had passed through the calf muscle, missing the bone but causing significant tissue damage. Blood was flowing steadily but not spurting. No major arteries hit, but enough tissue destruction that infection was a near certainty if they couldn't get him to proper medical care. She bandaged it as well as she could with their limited supplies, using pressure and elevation to slow the bleeding. Park bit down on his jacket sleeve to muffle his sounds of pain. "You're going to make it," she told him. "The wound's bad, but not fatal. We'll get you home." "Is that true, or is that another lie?" Park asked through gritted teeth. Chen met his eyes. "It's true. The wound itself won't kill you. Whether we make it home, that's still uncertain. But this specific injury, right now, you'll survive it if we can keep it clean and keep moving." "Okay," Park breathed. "Okay, that's something." Carver returned from checking the perimeter. No immediate pursuit. Either they lost us in the darkness, or they're organizing for a larger search. Either way, we need to move. "Park can't walk," Chen said. "We'll need to support him." "Then we support him. Doherty, Kim, you two carry him. Hayes, you're on point. Martinez, you stay with Dr. Chen in the center. I'll take rear security. We move slow and careful. No more surprises." They started moving again, this time with the knowledge that they were being actively hunted. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow could hide an enemy. The psychological pressure was immense, but Chen noticed something interesting. The group was functioning better under real threat than they had under imagined ones. The phantom radio had given them passive hope. This gave them active purpose. They were no longer waiting to be rescued. They were fighting their way home. The difference was subtle but profound. By dawn, they'd covered another 8 kilometers, putting them roughly 19 kilometers from friendly lines. Park's wound had stopped bleeding, but the leg was swelling badly. Martinez had rallied slightly, the adrenaline from combat cutting through his exhaustion enough to keep him moving. Hayes was leading the group with renewed confidence, his skills as a point man finally getting proper use. They found shelter in an abandoned farm building, roof mostly intact, walls providing wind protection, enough concealment to risk a few hours' rest. Chen did an assessment of everyone's condition while Carver posted security. Martinez was still shaking, but functional. Hayes was tired but steady. Doherty and Kim were exhausted but uninjured. Park was in significant pain but managing it. Carver himself was running on fumes, but still maintaining command presence. "We're close," she told them as they huddled together for warmth. 19 kilometers. If we can do one more push tonight, we make friendly lines by dawn. "And if we run into more Chinese patrols?" Doherty asked. "Then we fight," Carver said simply. "We're done hiding. We're done waiting. We're going home, and anything that gets in the way gets dealt with." It wasn't sophisticated tactics, it wasn't nuanced strategy, but it was clear and direct and gave them something to hold on to. Chen pulled out her journal one more time and made her final field notes. Day 11. Contact with enemy forces resulted in 1 wounded, no KIA. Group cohesion remains strong under genuine threat. All 7 soldiers maintaining function despite extreme conditions. 19 kilometers from friendly lines. Extraction now depends on movement capability rather than psychological stability. Personal note: the Phantom radio bought us time. The truth gave us purpose. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. If we make it home, I'll spend years unpacking the ethics. If we don't, none of it matters anyway. Final personal note: I would do it all again. Part 5. Resolution and Legacy. They left the abandoned farmhouse at 1800 hours on day 11 and walked into the teeth of a winter storm. The snow started as light flurries, then built to a steady fall that reduced visibility to maybe 50 meters. It made movement harder, but also provided concealment. Chinese patrols would be grounded in this weather just like everyone else. Chen walked between Hayes and Martinez, one hand on each man's shoulder to maintain contact when visibility dropped to nearly zero. Behind her, she could hear Doherty and Kim supporting Park between them, the wounded man's labored breathing audible even over the wind. The cold was savage now, well below freezing, with wind chill pushing it into the range where exposed skin froze in minutes. Chen couldn't feel her feet. Her hands were numb inside gloves that were never designed for this climate. Her face was a mask of ice where her breath had frozen to her scarf. But they kept moving. 1 kilometer, then 2, then 5. At 2100 hours, they stopped to rest and check navigation. Carver pulled out his compass and map, trying to read positions by the light of a carefully shielded match. 14 kilometers, he said. If we maintain pace, we hit the MLR by 0400 hours. The MLR, main line of resistance. The shifting boundary between UN forces and Chinese positions, the official front line, the place where they'd be back among friendly forces. Home, or close enough. "Can we maintain pace?" Kim asked. He was supporting most of Park's weight now, and the strain was showing in his voice. "We will," Chen said, "because the alternative is freezing to death out here, and I didn't survive 9 days in a crater just to die 14 kilometers from safety." It was the kind of thing the Phantom radio might have said, but this time it was true, grounded in reality rather than delusion. They could make 14 kilometers. The math worked. The only question was whether their bodies would hold together long enough to complete it. They walked. The snow got worse. Martinez started mumbling to himself, not hallucinating exactly, but losing coherence from exhaustion and cold. Chen kept one hand on his shoulder, providing physical contact and reassurance, keeping him anchored to reality through touch when words weren't enough. At 2300 hours, Hayes raised a fist for halt. Chen tensed, preparing for another contact, another firefight. But Hayes was pointing ahead, excitement in his voice. "Wire! I found wire!" Chen moved forward to see. Tangled in the snow-covered vegetation was a strand of communications wire, American standard, the kind used for field telephones between positions, which meant they were close to friendly lines, close enough that infrastructure existed. "We're in the buffer zone," Carver said, "maybe 5 kilometers from actual positions. We need to be careful now. Trigger-happy sentries shoot first and check identification later." They moved even slower now, following the wire as it led roughly south. The snow began to ease around 0200 hours, visibility improving enough that Chen could see terrain features again. A hill to the east, a frozen stream to the west. The wire leading them like Theseus' thread through the labyrinth. At 0300 hours, Hayes stopped again. This time his voice was different, not excitement, but something closer to awe. "Checkpoint! I see a checkpoint!" Chen looked ahead and felt her heart skip. There, maybe 200 meters away, was a sandbagged position with a guard tower, an American flag hanging limp in the still air after the storm, smoke rising from a warming fire. "Home." "All right," Carver said. His voice was shaking slightly, the first crack in his command presence Chen had seen in 11 days. "Standard approach protocol. We move slow, hands visible, no sudden movements." "Hayes, you call out identification when we're at 50 meters. Everyone else, stay in tight formation and let me do the talking." They walked toward the checkpoint like supplicants approaching a shrine. Chen felt tears freezing on her face and couldn't quite believe they were real. After everything, after the crater, after Kowalski's death, after the phantom radio and the lies and the collapse and the running and the fighting, they were going to make it. "Halt! Identify yourselves!" The checkpoint came from the checkpoint, sharp and professional. Hayes called back, "Friendly, American patrol, 7 personnel, 1 wounded, coming in. Advance slowly, keep your hands where we can see them." They walked forward, hands raised, weapons lowered. As they got closer, Chen could see soldiers emerging from the checkpoint, bundled against the cold, rifles ready, but relaxing as they recognized American uniforms and equipment. A sergeant came forward to meet them. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "Lieutenant Carver? We marked you KIA 9 days ago." "Reports of our death were exaggerated," Carver said. His voice cracked on the last word, control finally slipping. "Request immediate medical evacuation for 1 wounded and general support for all personnel." "Already called it in, sir. Choppers will be here in 20 minutes." The sergeant was staring at them, clearly trying to process 7 living ghosts walking out of territory that had been written off as lost. "How did you? Where have you been?" "Long story," Carver said. "We'll debrief later. Right now, get my men inside and warm." They were ushered into the checkpoint, into a small bunker with a functioning heater that felt like heaven after 11 days of freezing. Someone handed Chen coffee, real coffee, hot, black, perfect. She wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. Martinez was crying silently. Hayes was staring at the coffee like he'd forgotten what it was. Park was being examined by a medic who kept shaking his head in amazement at the improvised field dressing Chen had applied. Doherty and Kim sat together, still holding each other up, even though they didn't need to anymore. "Ma'am?" A young soldier approached Chen hesitantly. "Are you the psychologist, Dr. Chen?" "Yes." "They said you were with the patrol. They said you'd been... that you were probably..." He trailed off. "Probably dead," Chen finished. "Yeah, we got that impression too." The soldier smiled uncertainly. "Well, welcome back, ma'am. You want some food? We've got sea rats heating up." Chen thought about the 6 cans they'd rationed over 11 days, about feeding Martinez by hand, about Kowalski dying while they pretended rescue was coming. "Yes," she said, "food would be good." The helicopters arrived at 0410 hours. 2 Sikorsky H-19s that landed in the checkpoint's LZ and immediately started loading personnel. A doctor tried to separate Chen from the soldiers, insisting she needed her own medical evaluation, but she refused. "I stay with them," she said. "Until they're in proper care, I stay with them." The doctor looked at Lieutenant Carver, who nodded. "She's right. We stay together." They loaded into the helicopters as a unit, 7 soldiers and 1 psychologist who'd walked 43 kilometers through enemy territory in a winter storm. As the helicopter lifted off, Chen looked down at the checkpoint growing smaller below them, at the terrain they'd crossed, at the frozen hills that had nearly become their grave.